Using words while you communicate data can make your numbers accessible to your audiences in totally new ways. To understand this, I'll put a relatively simple bar chart in front of you. Notice how you process this graph. Right? As you scan through it, you're left to make assumptions. Why did certain bars increase, decrease, or stay relatively flat? Check out the difference when I add 3 bullets below this graph. Suddenly, the data becomes a little bit more accessible. You have a sense of why things are decreasing, when they increase, what is the reason. Words make our data accessible to our audience. So whenever we're communicating information and we're using a graph or a chart, we always want to add enough words to make it understandable. The next challenge becomes, well, how do you do this in a way that looks intentional and well-designed? I know this is a question that I struggled with when I was first starting out in the data visualization space. Kept wondering, where do I put the annotations? How do I format them so that they look well polished? Today, I thought I'd share all that I've learned and the 3 guidelines that I typically follow to decide where do I place my annotations on a chart. Let's jump right in. First guideline is to annotate as close to the data as possible. Now, really what this means in practice is putting that annotation directly on the graph if you have the space. Now, if we look at the previous example, you probably noticed there's absolutely no space on the graph. So technically, that bulleted list right below the chart is about as close as we're going to get. Could maybe move it off to the side, but it's still off the chart itself. So to take a step backward, we want to ask ourselves, can we create more space to annotate directly on that chart? One way to do that is to remove the grid lines. Now I can move that bulleted list directly onto the chart. Feels a little crammed, so I want to think about what else I could do to create more white space here. I could consider slightly expanding the vertical axis range. This just gives me a little bit more space around those 3 bullets. Then I could think about how could I bring these annotations closer to the data. So I could break them up into smaller text boxes and put each point directly near the data that it describes. I could also think about changing to a different graph type, maybe using a less ink-heavy chart like a line chart. So this could work well because now I have space below the line that I could move some of those annotations. That's the first design guideline. Let's look at the second. Now, the second design strategy is to create clean lines between the data elements and the words. There are a number of ways that you could implement this strategy. So for instance, we could take those annotations and we can create clean lines as your eyes browse the data markers down to the annotations. And I've done that by simply changing the way that I justify the text and moving it slightly over. If I went back to the bar chart view, I could align the annotations to the edge of a bar. Just creates an overall cleaner look. But also, as your eyes scan one element, they can quickly scan in a straight line to the next element. So it creates this visual connection between these 2 things that help provide a deeper understanding. Now, if you don't have the space to align the annotations directly near the data, like we're doing here, you could also use other clean lines on the chart itself. So for instance, you could use the chart area borders. Maybe you align those annotations to the top, off to the side, down on the horizontal x-axis. You could use a combination of these approaches. So in this case, I've put the historical annotations at the top and then placed that forecasted annotation to the right. And I've aligned it to that right edge by simply right aligning the text. Now I actually like this view here because it gives me just a little bit more space. I can elaborate further on the historical context, and then I have that forecast which is separated. All right, this brings us to the third strategy here, which is to format the words and the data similarly. Sometimes this doesn't happen because the tools that we use to create our graphs and the tools that we use to annotate are completely different. So they have different default settings. Or in my case, I built this chart in PowerPoint and I'm adding a text box in PowerPoint, but the problem is the default settings of my text box and my graph, they're totally different. So it's actually pretty easy to see how the words in the graph may not be in alignment. So really what you're looking at here is making sure that font style, font sizes, colors used in the graph, they align to one another. I'll switch from Arial in the text box to Avenir, make it a consistent color and size. Or if I formatted this chart differently, maybe used an all black line and used orange and blue, then I'd want to bring that design element to the annotations as well. I've shown you many different ways to annotate your graph. None are right nor wrong, just different. It all depends on the type of data you have and how much you have to say. So my hope is that by sharing these 3 guidelines, you'll have a better sense of how to navigate the many different options and hopefully make a more intentional decision. You may be thinking of examples, though, where no matter what you do, you just don't have space on your graph to annotate directly. I'm here to tell you that all 3 principles still apply. You just need to get creative about what you think of as the chart area. So to demonstrate, I'm going to take a relatively ink-heavy graph, this diverging bar chart, where no matter what we do, removing grid lines, expanding the axis range, and so forth, we can't annotate directly on the graph, especially if we have something lengthy we need to share. So in this case, what I'll do is in my tool, I'll think about expanding the chart area. So I'm just expanding it to the right-hand side here, shrinking down my graph a little bit. And now I have a ton of white space off to the right-hand side that I could use to annotate directly. And there you have it. Another example of how you can annotate in a way that feels thoughtful, intentional, and very cohesive with your data. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, be sure to give us a thumbs up or let us know in the comments down below. So if you enjoy thinking about the design of your graphs, I'm gonna point you to this video here. It's a little bit longer, but it goes through 10 different considerations you wanna be thinking of when you're designing your charts. My name's Alex, and I'll see you next time.